Welcome back to Questing Beast. I'm Ben. Today we're taking a look at Neverland, which is a fantasy role-playing setting by Andrew Kolb. This was originally designed for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, but as we will see by looking through it, most of the stats involved are very minimalistic and very easy to adapt to whatever rule set you happen to like, especially to old-school D&D rules. Here's the back of our cover. And before we begin, a quick shout out to some of our new patrons over on Patreon, including Anton Belov, Isaac L. Wheeler, Yaron Farkash, Jason Weaver, Nathaniel Schleif, Christopher McConnell, Dominic Cascarelli, Lex Master, Chris Ritner, The Chicken, Gregory M. Hicks, and Gregors Wazalewski. Thank you so much for supporting us on Patreon. Links are down in the description below if you would like to join them. So, some introductory remarks here. This book is beautiful looking. It is all done in hardback. You can see that it has a gold foil on the front. Beautiful production quality. One remarkable thing, it is $25, which is an incredible price for a book at this level of quality. A book like this would typically run about $50 or so. So that's a pretty amazing price. I will put links in the description for where you can pick this up for yourself. It kind of came out of nowhere. I didn't really see any buzz about this, and I'm usually kind of up on new things in the old school scene that are on in production. So this really took me by surprise when it suddenly dropped just a week or two ago. We have these beautiful end papers that are done this kind of gold, almost like wallpaper. It's glossy paper on the inside with these nice vine borders around the edges. This is put out by Andrews McNeil Publishing, which normally does a lot of comic book collections, but they are a pretty big publisher that has a lot of reach, and they're in Barnes & Noble and a lot of major stores. So it's really interesting to see them getting into publishing independent role-playing games. It's one of the first times I've seen that happen. Our binding here is all done in stitched binding. So even if you go to the middle of the book, the thing lies completely flat, which is really great. And of course, there is a nice gold bookmark here. The general format of this is it is a setting for Neverland, which is of course J.M. Barrie's setting for the Peter Pan book, which is now in the public domain. So this is all perfectly legal. The structure is very similar to what we've seen before in Hot Springs Island, which is one of my favorite settings. I'll put a link to that up here at the top. It has an island, of course, Neverland, and it's broken down into hexes, and each hex has a whole bunch of things that can happen there. There's a clock for determining what time it is and how long it takes to go from one hex to another. There's all sorts of random tables for figuring out what's in each hex, and you can explore from place to place and unravel the mysteries there. This seems to take place in the future of Neverland after the events from the book, and a bunch of things have changed over time. I love the illustrations. So as far as I can tell, this book was all written and illustrated, and I think designed all by the same person, which is a pretty monumental undertaking. So we have cover, cartography, and interior illustrator, and he was the lead writer and developer, all the same person. So a really phenomenal work of art. You can tell this was a real labor of love. Start off with the world and some general rules for what's going on in Neverland. Some of the changes include that Captain Hook's ship is now crewed by skeleton pirates, or at least they are kind of alive at night. They look like humans, but during the day they collapse back into skeletons, the exception being Hook himself, who has captured a piece of a falling star that allows him to survive during the day. You have factions of mermaids. You have this clock here, where you can keep track of the amount of hours in Neverland, and you can keep track of the amount of time it takes to get from one place to another. You have the structure of a month in Neverland with the phases of the moon, which can become relevant, along with where the giant crocodile is going to be during each of these weeks. There's a lot of great graphic design being used here in order to make it much easier to run, even for players who aren't used to a more open world hex crawl style. The illustrations here are pitch perfect to me. They remind me of the concept art that you might see for a Disney's Peter Pan movie. It has this very mid-century design, which is very nostalgic to me, and I think hits exactly the right tone. We have some advanced rules, including how to run random encounters, searching things, scavenging the dead, running chase sequences, with some really interesting and innovative rules. All of this stuff can easily be yanked out and stuck into your own game. It's all very modular. We get into the cast here, which is a quite large and extensive monster manual, covering all sorts of things that you might find in Neverland. A lot of these, I think, are made up just for this book. I'll be honest, I haven't actually read the original Peter Pan, although I've seen several movie versions of it. So I'm not totally clear on the extent to which some of these are in the book and some which are made up, but they're all really great. The way that these stat blocks are done is it has hit dice, the number of hit points, armor, which is of course just AC. You have their speed, and there's an interesting system for saves here where it simply gives you 3 saves, and there's just 3 numbers in a row. Basically, the first one is good at saving against this, medium, and terrible at saving. So whenever you have some sort of effect where you think a save would apply, you simply pick the correct number based on whether this monster would be good at saving against that or not. And then in order to do attack bonus, it says you just add the first 2 saves together. So bog bodies, which I guess are down here, would have an attack bonus of +5. Now, the old school method of doing this is to use an attack bonus that's exactly the same as the hit dice. And by and large, that sort of lines up. Not exactly. So I suppose you could take your own option there. We have some attacks, we have some specials, but in contrast to what you typically see in 5th edition stuff, it is quite minimal. This makes it much easier to adapt and much easier to run, because you don't have to read through a giant block of stats in order to run the monster. You can scan it pretty quickly and you're good to go. Throughout the whole book, we see a lot of bullet points being used to allow you to easily scan the material and pull out just the important stuff. We have giant insects that you can run into. The great white bird, which is like the size of a skyscraper almost. It's basically a dragon, but it's also a pelican, which I love. We have all sorts of mythological things like Jenny Greenteeth, which is sort of a fae living in a swamp. And we have an entire fairy kingdom, or a fairy parallel universe, that also exists here that you can enter, run by Queen Mab. That's where the fairies come from, and you can visit it yourself and explore there. One of the major factions is the mermaids, which is kind of a mermaid trading company. They trade with a lot of different types of goods. And there's all these great little touches. Like, for example, the mermaids are divided into different types, which are basically alto, baritone, sopranos, and tenors. I love that little touch. We have some clues as to what may have happened to the Darling children, including we have Michael Nicholas Darling, who's now known as the Mountain Smith. Peter Pan is still at large. You can run into him, roaming around the island, fighting pirates. The pirates, as you encounter them over and over, get stronger and stronger. You can see that in their stats there, they have X for some values. So that's the number of times that you've encountered them. They learn as you fight them and get tougher and tougher. Queen Mab, Queen of the Fairies. We have factions of spiders. Similar to what we saw in Hot Springs Island, we have lots of different factions here that all have their own motivations, their own alliances, their own enemies, and how all of these things interact with each other can make Neverland a more political experience than you would typically see in D&D. What were in the books, the Indian tribes have been replaced with the Green Folk, or the Tilwith Teg, which are basically types of dryads. And Wendy Moira Angela Darling is now the Swamp Hag. So she's a lot older and she lives in a swamp, but she's still Wendy. We get into the island here. So we actually have a picture of the island, Neverland, with the hexes laid out here. We have quick hex references over here. I would have liked to see this map more prominently displayed, maybe at the beginning. As it is, though, you can find it at the end, where it is done in a fold-out map, which is really nice. It's a beautiful little map. Moving along here, we have some details for each of these hexes. Now, while a book like Hot Springs Island had a kind of master table that you would flip back to roll to see what was on your hex, this one has all of the tables right with that hex, which I think is a good decision. It just saves on flipping. So if you're here, then you can roll on here to find out if you have an encounter, the D20 table. There might be an area effect happening. For example, there could be an empty animal nest. There could be an obscuring and unnatural fog that drops in temperature. You can roll for creatures to find there, roll for NPCs to find there. If you explore there, spending extra time digging into that hex and looking for clues, you can find new stuff. Everything that you might need is built right into it. There's something called chime hours. So at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., the island, something weird happens in every hex. There's a weird effect. So that can give you even more incentive to explore. Because if you're in a hex during the chime hours, then you get to see its one weird thing. The Jolly Roger, rope bridges. And I like how even the hex has all of the nearby hexes with their numbers. So you immediately know if players go in any direction, you know what page to flip to because you know the number of that hex. A lot of great thought being put into the design of the book and making it easier to run. Much more so than I see in typical 5th edition books, that's for sure. It's great to see this book, which is definitely targeted at a more mainstream audience, borrow lots of the techniques that have been developed in the old school scene over the last 10 years or so, and really polishing those and bringing them to a possibly bigger audience. We have Elfheim, which is the kind of parallel universe fairyland. There's a couple different ways to get there from Neverland. Some of them you have to discover for yourself. Some weird customs that you might find there, what travel is like. And this is quite charming. So when you travel in Elfheim, it basically uses the same depth mechanic that we found in Emmy Allen's The Gardens of Yin. In fact, that is credited near the back of the book. So really, you could just take the Gardens of Yin and transpose it directly into this universe as what Fairyland looks like. But this does have 24 different environments, and you roll dice to try and push further and further into Fairyland, hoping to get to the castle, which is always visible out there on the horizon. And the Dungeon Master can roll a die to try and take away from the number that you're rolling if Fairyland is resisting you, or they can add to your number to push you further forward. Now we're starting to get into resources, and there's a lot of really great stuff here. So a lot of the hexes mention a building or an environment there, and then this gives you a more detailed layout. So here we have coral caves for the mermaids. We have a crocodile that you can crawl inside. This is definitely becoming a theme in the old school scene. We saw things like Lauren's Song of the Bachelor, which I reviewed previously. That has a crocodile that you can crawl inside. And I believe David McGrogan from who did Yoon Suin is also doing a giant sentient crocodile. So it's something in the water. I don't know. Everyone wants to make giant crocodiles. We have a giant anthill full of huge insects that you can explore. We have the home underground of the Lost Boys. The Great White Bird's Nest, which is high up in the sky on the clouds. How do you get there? Well, you're going to have to be able to fly, and there are ways that you can learn to fly. We have the Iron Mines. So these are mines you can start exploring, and it gives you tons of locations, along with if it's hot, neutral, or cold, that you can use to add variety to that location. This definitely is old school in the sense of its focus being very strongly on giving you tons of tools. This isn't about long, verbose backstory and lore. This is about concrete information that is immediately usable in your game. We have the Skull Island, which contains a randomly generated mega dungeon, which is fairly gonzo in tone. It has 100 skull rooms that you can simply roll on to create your own mega dungeon and then connect them up with lines and easily have a new mega dungeon every time the players want to explore there. There's plenty of blanks that are intentionally written into these descriptions that you can quickly fill with monsters, items, or other things from these resources. So for example, we have D20 skull creatures of the tiny or small variety. So if you want a small creature, you can easily just pull out one of these kind of templates, fill in some blanks, and you have a unique monster that's going to surprise the players. Then we have D20 ones that are medium to large, and then another D20 monsters that are huge or gargantuan. We have Wendy's Hut. We start getting into all sorts of great tools like adventures, D20 specific adventures, D20 random adventures where you can fill stuff in Mad Lib style to create your own. We have 100 different types of animals if you just need some animals to throw at them. We have things that fairies want to trade. We have tricks that they'll play on you, wards. We have locations in Neverland. We have things like loot that you can find, of course, D100 table. You're going to be looting bodies. You need to know what's there. Traps that the Lost Boys have been setting. We have random objects that you can discover, games that the mermaids are playing, traps that are found in the mountains, traps that are created by spiders. More than enough traps that you're ever going to need. We have D100 rumor table. And it just goes on and on. We've got our Star Surge, which is basically random wild magic that can happen if you mess around with pieces of falling stars, which is, of course, what stardust is made out of, or pixie dust. We have Wandering Strangers, what they're doing, why they're doing it. It's just tons of useful information. So rather than feeling at a loss, especially if you're a new Dungeon Master, you can easily just pull out this book, switch to the resources table at the back before you start a game, even if it's just an hour before, and very quickly whip up all sorts of interesting things that could be happening. There's an interesting section in the back here, Chapter 6, Tales from Neverland. That's basically a bunch of short little stories that have been designed to feel like they are in a old-fashioned fairy tale book that can give you ideas for adventure hooks or just situations that you can use. I suppose it just helps you get in the right mindset for running this type of game. And a really great thing at the back is we have basically the making of. So a sketchbook, ideas, and stuff like that, so you can see what the author was thinking. Very few books do this in role-playing games, and I really love to see it. I love that there's some extra resources here that was an inspiration for this book, including Carapace by the Goblin's Henchman, Gardens of Yin by Dying Stylishly, that's Emmy Allen, and Hot Springs Island by the Swordfish Island Peoples. That would be Jacob Hurst and friends. Some great concept art here for how the look of the book developed, along with some pictures that he wanted to put in the book but didn't quite make it. Development of the cover, along with some cool thumbnails. These information maps of how all of the different factions work, who loves who, who's hating with who's trading, and so on. And then we have some character sheets at the back. And look, they are even designed to be ripped out. Although this book's so nice, I would really feel terrible about doing that. But it comes with some kind of 5th edition-ish classes. The Big Game Hunter, the Child Pickpocket, the Parent Raconteur, the Teen Prodigy, the Holy Orphan, and the Stranded Pirate. Now, one problem here is that these are printed back to back, so if you do rip them out, you can only really use one side, like unless you photocopied it. But you can see that statistically it's designed for 5th edition with your skills and so on. But, you know, most D&D books, as long as it's not 4th edition, are going to be very compatible with each other, so it's not really going to be a big deal. Some quick references at the back, along with lots of names, so that you're never at a loss for your NPC names, and your D100 loot table, and of course your map at the very back. Whew! All right, so that is quite a book. It is a beautiful piece of art, completely surprising, coming out of nowhere, great for 5th edition, great for any old school rules that you happen to be using. It does have its own tone, of course, as Neverland. So I would recommend perhaps putting it in a kind of demi-plane that players can access. Maybe it's shrouded by mist out in the middle of the ocean. Maybe if you're out in a Spelljammer and you're traveling the stars of the D&D universe, you can try and find the second star to the right and end up in Neverland. Lots of options there. The author even recommends adding it as part of the archipelago of Hot Springs Island, which I think is a fun idea. Anyway, links are in the description below. As I mentioned before, it is $25, which is an absurdly low price for a book of this quality. It's one of my favorite things that I've bought this year. I'm super stoked to keep reading and digging into it. Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching this video, everybody. I'll see you next time.